Have you ever been playing on your Warlock and thought to yourself, Warlock is good and all, but there just aren't enough ways to heal myself? Wow, I can't even get through that. Okay, let's be honest. Warlock is really good. Definitely the best class in PvE in the current meta, and I have 3 great builds to show you to completely abuse that. The last of which is the build that I think will be best for Witch Queen. A build so strong that it turns you into a healing, grenade-chucking tank in PvE. Jeez, I've only been talking for like 20 seconds and I'm already scaring myself with the implications of this, so let's just get into it before I start screaming about how broken these builds are. So let's get one thing straight before I get too into things. Warlock has a ton of build potential. I'm going to discuss a few builds that are survivability and grenade abuse based for solar warlocks, but you could pretty easily do some tooling to make them work on other subclasses, even though I won't be discussing that in detail. The first build that I'm going to talk about is more geared towards general play. It doesn't feature any insanely overpowered mods, but all the mods are easy to acquire, so even if today is your first day playing Destiny, you could get all the mods required in less than a week. Don't get me wrong though, it's still a pretty strong build that you could even get away using in endgame activities. The main pillars of this build are Elemental Well mods, which can be acquired for only 3 mod components from the Splicer Servitor and the Wayfinder's Compass in the Helm. Although after the release of Witch Queen, these mods will be sold by 8 to 1 in the tower. Since the selections of mods offered by these vendors rotate daily, you should be able to get all the mods you need in only a few days if you don't already have them. Elemental Well mods are already very strong, but they are a bit overshadowed by overpower builds in the current meta since masterwork weapons can generate an orb every time 2 enemies are killed in quick succession. However, since that perk of master-breaking weapons is being removed in Witch Queen and being added to mods instead, Elemental Wells will definitely be in the new meta in my opinion. Although to be honest, some of the builds I'll be showing off today can already outshine many of the overpower builds, they just tend to be overlooked in my experience. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into the first build. Here's what you'll need. Any solar subclass, 100 discipline, or as much as you can get, 3 solar pieces of armor including the bond, elemental armaments, elemental ordnance, well of life, well of ordnance, bountiful wells, and at least 1 solar weapon. The following mods aren't required, but they do make the build much better. Grenade Kickstart, Bomber, Absolution or Innervation, and Ashes to Assets. Now I know that sounds like a lot, but bear with me, this build is actually a lot simpler than it looks. It basically boils down to using your grenades to generate wells and then collecting those wells to recharge your grenade along with some other benefits. Don't worry, we'll get to that. Although there are a lot of parts to this build, many of them aren't required. However, if you want the build to be as broken as what I'm showing you here, then you will need pretty much everything. Even though it's a lot, once you set it up, it's stupidly easy to use and anyone can become a grenade-chucking healing tank in PvE. Let's talk about the essentials first. I prefer Well of Radiance for the increased healing, but this build will work as long as you have any solar subclass equipped. Based on the situation, you may want top tree for better movement or bottom tree for better ad clear. You also obviously want to have as much discipline as possible since this is a grenade recharge build, and higher discipline means a faster grenade cooldown. It's not necessarily required to have 100, but just remember that if you miss your grenade and don't generate any wells, then having low discipline will make your grenade recovery period much longer. The 2 core mods of this build are Well of Ordnance and Elemental Ordnance. Elemental Ordnance generates a well matching your subclass element for each grenade kill. Well of Ordnance restores grenade energy every time you pick up a solar elemental well. How much grenade energy, you ask? 10%. Now I know that doesn't sound like much, and to be fair it really isn't, but as you'll soon see, that 10% starts to add up fast in frankly quite ridiculous ways. We'll come back to that in a minute. The next mod that you want is Elemental Armaments. Now this mod is really more of a failsafe to make sure that you can still get your grenade back if you miss a throw and don't generate wells, although I think it can be more efficient at generating wells than the alternative, and that would be stacking 2 well ordnances to increase the grenade energy gain from a well to 15% instead of 10. Elemental Armaments works by adding a chance to generate an elemental well that matches your subclass element if the kill came from a weapon with the same element. So basically, solar weapon kills on a solar subclass generate wells. What are the chances that you'll generate a well on a kill though? Well, the chances increase by 15% for every red bar enemy killed and 35% for every elite or higher enemy killed. That all boils down to a guaranteed extra well generated for every 7th solar weapon kill. However, it's much more likely that wells will be generated in fewer kills since you exceed a 50% chance to generate a well after only 4 kills. If you're using a solar primary weapon to clear as, then you will generate extra wells with basically no extra effort or thought on your part. Sounds like a good deal, right? That's because it is, and I haven't even explained why it's broken yet, so let's get to the mod that makes all this so good next. So one mod makes this already pretty good build even better. Just imagine for a moment if all the well generating methods that I just talked about generated 2 wells instead of 1. That'd be pretty busted, right? Well, that's exactly what Bountiful Wells does. Contrary to the rather long and confusing description to the mod, it doesn't appear to work the way that it's described. It has some pretty strange properties with stacked mods that I don't really want to get into, mostly because it's confusing and not super useful. Also, I'm too lazy to test it. So just know that in this scenario, it makes elemental armaments and elemental ordnance generate 2 wells instead of 1 every time they proc. Now, if you're using at least 1 solar weapon and are chucking grenades as often as you can, this can get really crazy really fast. If there are a lot of ads to clear, you can pretty easily get many more wells on the ground than are necessary to fully recharge your grenade, and I haven't even talked about the optional mods to get your grenade back faster yet. I mean, just look at this. You see all that? That is what a broken build looks like. Now, let's talk about the healing part of the build that I mentioned earlier. The next mod is another fantastic one because it's quite strong, and it doesn't even require you to do anything more than what you were already doing. The mod I'm talking about is Well of Life. It basically just improves your health regeneration when you collect a solar elemental well. Simple, yes, but still strong. Now, one of the biggest problems I had with mods that start or improve health regeneration is that the regeneration is still cancelled if you take damage. It might not sound like a big deal, but in the heat of battle, it's rarely worth it to run into a group of enemies to collect a well or an orb if you're just going to immediately take damage and be right back where you started. However, Well of Life is quite unique to many of the other health regeneration mods. That is for one simple reason. It regenerates your health by a fixed amount regardless of other factors like taking damage. That means you could still run around in groups of enemies collecting wells and the regeneration buff would still persist. It also stacks on top of your normal health regeneration, making it ridiculously fast. How fast is the health regeneration, you ask? It's about 13 HP per second for 11 seconds. That means you regenerate about 3/4 of your health and shields in those 11 seconds. Now, this isn't fast enough to make you invincible, but it does make it fast enough that you will hardly ever have to retreat into cover to regen health, especially with the absurd amount of wells that you can generate with this build. I definitely prefer to have this mod for more difficult activities, but you could stack an extra charge with one of the other mods instead, such as Well of Ordnance, if you want to spec fully into the grenade recharge. Alright, that's it for the essentials of the build. The next few mods aren't necessarily required, but that certainly doesn't mean that they're any less useful. Some of these I personally wouldn't even want to run this build without, and that brings us to the first extra mod. Or well, I guess I should say choice of mods, because there are 2 armor mods that can be used to improve grenade recharge rates. The first of these is Impact Induction. This mod reduces grenade recharge by 20% for 1 stack and 30% for 2 stacks when you deal damage with a melee attack. Now this is quite useful, especially in a pinch when you need your grenade back quickly without expending any resources. However, I tend to avoid this choice due to the fact that, well, meleeing enemies in endgame content like contest mode raids, Grandmaster Nightfalls, and Master Raids tends to be a death sentence, even with a good survivability build. Plus there's the fact that it actually requires you to think. I mean, we can't have that. Are you even really playing the game unless you think as little as possible? For that reason, I prefer the alternative, which is Grenade Kickstart. This mod refunds 15% grenade energy for 1 stack or 25% for 2 stacks immediately after throwing your grenade. That's it. No thought, no hassle. Just instant grenade energy, baby. In practice, this makes chaining grenades much easier and it allows you to continue only having to think about getting grenade kills and collecting wells. There are only 2 downsides. The first is that it requires stasis charged arms. That's not terrible since elemental armaments and elemental ordnance can both be equipped on any type of armor. However, the real downside is the cost of the mod. 4 energy per stack. That's not bad by itself, but 2 stacks cost 8 energy, plus another 2 for elemental armaments. Ouch. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely worth it if you want as little of a grenade cooldown period as possible, but if you value gunplay more, you may want a loader mod to reduce reload speeds. My personal preference would be 1 grenade kickstart, a loader for my primary weapon, and then elemental armaments. However, you can tune this to better fit your playstyle if you want. The next most important mod is definitely Bomber. It restores grenade energy every time you use your class ability. This varies from class to class, but for Warlocks it's 25% for 1 stack and 30% for 2. It only costs 2 energy, so it's not terrible to stack it on your bond, but you may consider equipping a different mod instead of the second stack, since 2 bombers only grants a 5% increase over 1. If you have the space on your bond, a good choice for a replacement would be Distribution. It restores energy to all of your abilities if used within 5 meters of an enemy. 5% energy to all your abilities to be exact. It's not necessarily better or worse than 2 stacks of Bomber, it totally depends on your personal preference. The point is that this mod is a great failsafe if you find yourself short on grenade energy with no wells ready to pick up. Just throw it on a rift and get nearly a third of your grenade energy back. If you're running Well of Radiance, you can even get your rifts back much faster if your teammates stand in the rift. Alright, finally, these last 2 mods are the least important and could really be removed if you needed to, but I felt like they're still worth talking about briefly. Absolution and Innervation both give grenade energy every time you pick up an Orb of Power. This is very useful right now, but orbs will likely be much less plentiful in Witch Queen since masterworked weapons will no longer intrinsically generate orbs. It will still be useful, but you may want a scavenger mod or something else instead. The second mod is Ashes to Assets. It simply grants extra super energy on grenade kills. You get between 2.3% to 13% extra super energy depending on the strength of the enemy that you defeat. You can stack these mods, but the extra energy you get is very small and not worth it in my opinion. It's not strictly necessary for the build since it doesn't help with your grenade recharge or generate wells, but since you'll be getting lots of grenade kills anyway, you'll definitely notice a faster super cooldown. This can be extremely helpful if you and your team are relying on Well of Radiance for survivability, and even if you're not, a faster super cooldown is never a bad thing. Whew, wow. That took longer than I expected. Don't worry, the next builds will just make modifications to this one to fit different playstyles. That, of course, includes the final build that I think will break Warlock and turn it into a constantly healing grenade-throwing tank in PvE. The next build makes minor modifications to the previous one for a change in playstyle. The main change is a swap from Elemental Armaments to Explosive Wellmaker. You can keep Well of Life if you prefer survivability, or you can keep Elemental Armaments instead to generate an honestly ludicrous amount of Elemental Wells. We'll get to that. For the sake of clarity, let's list everything that we need for the build. Here's what you'll need. Any solar subclass, 100 discipline or as much as you can get, 3 solar pieces of armor including your bond, explosive wellmaker, elemental ordnance, well of life or elemental armaments, well of ordnance, bountiful wells, and at least 1 explosive weapon. And again, these mods aren't required, but they make the build much better. Grenade Kickstart, Bomber, Absolution or Innervation, and Ashes to Assets. The general idea of this build is the same, but it puts a much larger focus on gunplay. Even though only a couple mods have changed from the first build, the way you play with it is quite different. Let's talk about the new mod in this build first, Explosive Wellmaker. It works by generating 1 solar elemental well if you defeat 2 enemies within 2 seconds of each other with an explosive weapon. Let's not forget the fact that Bountiful Wells turns that 1 well per multi-kill into 2. For that reason, special grenade launchers are going to be extremely useful here. Obviously, the more explosive weapons you have here, the better, but a special ammo grenade launcher is going to almost always be the most useful, especially with how good blinding grenades already are for endgame activities. Okay, so while I was testing for this video, I actually discovered something amazing that definitely makes this build better. Now, there are rocket launchers in the heavy slot and grenade launchers in the special slot, but nothing for the primary slot to generate solar wells with, right? Well, that's completely untrue, everyone. Let me introduce you to Explosive Payload. Now, Explosive Payload and Timed Payload are nothing new. They roll on plenty of weapons like hand cannons and scout rifles. It's definitely one of, if not the best perk you can get on these weapons for PvE due to the increased damage and reduced damage fall off over range. To be honest, I didn't think this would be very practical at first. It was hard to get it to proc since the bullet damages enemies before the explosion does, so in free roam I was killing enemies with the bullet and not the explosion. Shooting the ground near enemies is inconsistent and does much less damage, so that's out too. That's when I realized that I should be testing on more difficult enemies. In endgame content, the bullet typically doesn't kill red bar enemies since they have more health. Rather, the explosion does. That means that you can get 2 red bar enemy kills with your primary weapon to generate a well. It's not necessary to run 3 explosive weapons, of course, but you can for maximum well generation if you want to. Despite how good that setup is, I still haven't even talked about the most broken part of the build. I've been avoiding this because I just know it's going to make me start yelling, but I guess I just gotta do it. I haven't had any coffee in at least a couple hours, so I'm sure nothing will go wrong. Okay, here we go. There's one new exotic that perfectly meets the criteria to take this very good build and break it wide open to generate a metric fuck ton of wells in the blink of an eye. An exotic coveted in Destiny 1. An exotic that melted bosses. An exotic that returned with a vengeance. That's right, you already know what it is. The Gallarhorn. Gallarhorn? Gajallarhorn? Now let me just start by saying that you don't need Gallarhorn to use this build. It's very good with any explosive weapons, so don't feel like not having Gallarhorn keeps you from using it at all. That being said, Gallarhorn is fucking busted! It's a fantastic weapon with great boss damage and ad clear. Just one shot can easily wipe out an entire room. And guess what mod generates wells with every explosive multi-kill? Gallarhorn can absolutely cover the ground in solar wells with a single shot when paired with Explosive Wellmaker. It's not just the initial explosion either. The tracking rockets count as explosive kills, for fuck's sake. This is even more prevalent in endgame content where enemies have more health and you often need to use heavy ammo weapons just to clear ads. Stack this with the rest of the build, you can get an insane amount of grenade recharge and healing potential with a single shot from this thing. Of course, Gallarhorn isn't the only good exotic. Vex Mythoclast is a great choice as well, with primary weapons getting a 40% damage buff to red bar enemies in Witch Queen. Of course, it would only work with the first build or this one if you decide to use the variant with elemental armaments, though. If you're a new player, a great exotic to use would be Sunshot, since it's both solar and deals explosive damage on kills. Overall, this build is very similar to the first. It just shifts the generation of wells from grenade kills to weapon kills. It's totally dependent on what your personal preference for playstyle is. Alright everybody, now for the moment I'm sure you've all been waiting for. That's right, the best Warlock build for Witch Queen. God, saying that makes me sound like every other generic Destiny YouTuber. But you know what? It's true, okay? I really believe that this build is the best for PvE and Witch Queen. Now, it uses the previous build as a basis, but it improves upon it in a couple essential ways. The main problem with the other builds for endgame activities is that you may be able to get infinite healing, but many enemies can still melt your entire health bar before you get a chance to heal. Well, if you're an experienced player, you know how to beat that little limitation with a single mod. What mod could be so incredible that it breaks the game wide open and makes endgame content much easier? What mod can turn warlocks into unkillable tanks in PvE? That's right, you know what it is. Say it with me, everyone. Protective Light. Now, I've already ranted about this mod before, so if you want to see a much more detailed explanation, and by that I mean me yelling at my screen for 3 minutes, then check out my Hunter build video. Wow, I really did just lose my mind yelling at pixels, huh? Anyway, all you need to know is that Protective Light gives you 50% damage resistance for 10 seconds when your shield breaks, as long as you have 2 stacks of charge with light. This mod is definitely not as easily accessible as the elemental well mods currently are, since it's only sold by 8 to 1 on random days throughout the year. However, if you can get your hands on it, it's without a doubt the best PvE mod in the game. Before we get to anything, let's go over everything you'll need to make this build work as efficiently as possible. Here's what you'll need. Well of Radiance, 100 Discipline, 3 Solar pieces of armor, including your bond, 1 Void piece of armor, Stasis armor, Protective Light, Elemental Charge, Explosive Wellmaker, Well of Life, Well of Ordnance, at least 1 explosive weapon, 1 or 2 grenade kickstarts, and 1 or 2 bombers. Let's talk about how it works. The first build focused on throwing as many grenades as possible to generate wells, and the second focused on using explosive weapons to generate wells for your grenades. This build sacrifices a bit of your offensive ad clear potential for survivability. I know that may not sound great, but just wait for it. I'll recap the mods really quick in case you skipped here for the endgame build, but if you want in-depth mod explanations, then go back and watch the other build sections of the video. Explosive Wellmaker generates a solar well if 2 enemies are killed by explosive weapons within 2 seconds of each other. You could also substitute this for elemental armaments, but it will not generate wells as quickly in most situations. Well of Ordnance gives you grenade energy every time you collect a solar elemental well. Well of Life gives you 11 seconds of healing when you collect a solar elemental well. Elemental Charge allows you to become charged with light every time you collect an elemental well. Protective Light gives you 50% damage resistance when your shield or white health is depleted. Grenade Kickstart gives grenade energy when your grenade is used. And Bomber gives grenade energy when you use your class ability. Now obviously you may not be able to recharge a grenade quite as quickly as with the other builds, but it honestly doesn't matter. If you're using an explosive weapon loadout, which you should be doing with this build, such as a blinding grenade launcher, explosive payload hand cannon, and Gjallarhorn, then you'll be generating tons of elemental wells. You can then collect those wells to simultaneously generate grenade energy, grant 11 seconds of healing, and charge with light so that you can proc protective light. One thing you might not know about that is that if you collect an elemental well it's the same element as your subclass, it actually grants 2 stacks of charge with light instead of 1 with elemental charge. I personally love how simple this build is to use. In extremely difficult content, it can take all of your focus to stay alive and complete the objective, so having a build with complicated activation conditions can actually work to your detriment in my experience. With this build, all you have to do is get kills and collect wells, and the build takes care of everything else for you. Even if it was difficult to activate, it would still be great, so the fact that you hardly have to think about using it makes the build even more potent. But wait, I can hear you wondering, that doesn't explain how you can get infinite healing and damage resistance. Well, firstly, Protective Light can be queued up for another use before your damage resistance buff runs out. If your shield breaks, Protective Light will proc, and you can immediately collect a Solar Well, which gives you 2 stacks of charge with light, immediately preparing Protective Light for another use. That's not all though. Oh no. I neglected to mention the main downside of Protective Light earlier, you see. You can never reactivate the Protective Light buff unless you regenerate some shield or white health, since it procs off shield break, not simply having low health. Good thing that the same well you collected to become charged with light will also proc Well of Life, giving you 11 seconds of continuous healing. Of course, sometimes you might be under so much fire that you still can't regenerate fast enough. Well, it's a good thing the well you collected that charged you with light and granted you healing also grants you grenade energy so you can throw your healing grenade to get to full health with an overshield. Are you beginning to see how broken this build is? It's actually ridiculous how many tools you have to stay alive with basically no effort. I mean, that's without even mentioning the grenade energy you get from other mods like Grenade Kickstart, and if the other members of your fire team are generating elemental wells. Holy shit, I haven't even talked about exotics like Phoenix Protocol, Lunafaction Boots, or Sunbracers. Like, I mean, all this on top of the fact that you have Well of Radiance, which you honestly wouldn't even need to survive with this build. And I know I'm yelling now, but this build is so fucking broken. So, closing thoughts. The main downside of this build is that it restricts which weapons you can use a bit. However, I think that that small downside is completely worth it for one of, if not the best, Warlock survivability build for PvE content. I was going to talk a bit about exotic armor, but endgame Warlocks pretty much exclusively use Phoenix Protocol or Lunafaction Boots, which both work great with this build. Also, I couldn't find a place to work it into the script naturally. But if you want to have fun chucking even more grenades with the first 2 builds, Sunbracers actually provide for an incredibly fun experience, and they show off the build's grenade abuse potential even more. Overall, I think this build will be my go-to choice anytime I'm running Warlock. It's just too good at keeping you alive, and no other solar build that I have ever seen has this much survivability. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you find this video informative and get some use out of the build. I have to give a huge shout out to my good friend Zico BMs, who first showed me the basic version of this build. If anyone else has ever covered this build or something similar, I haven't seen it myself, but thanks to them as well. If any of you find something that I missed or have a suggestion of something I should cover, then feel free to let me know in the comments. If you're still here after this absolute chonker of a video, first of all, I appreciate you. Consider subscribing. It's free and you can always unsub later. I do also stream on Twitch. I'll be streaming all day for day 1 of Witch Queen and the raid race, so hit me with a follow if you want to catch me live. Alright, I'm gonna go pass out now because this video was a lot of work. Thank you all. I appreciate you.